Will come to order. For what purpose does the gentlelady from New York seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Maloney. Page 13, after line 12, insert the following and redesignate the subsequent.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
I thank the chairman for yielding, and the ranking member, and all of my colleagues that have worked with me on this amendment. This amendment would really address the funding of CFIUS under the new bill. There would be an increased workload, and it would dramatically increase. And in order to make sure that they have the amount of money that's needed to conduct transactions in a timely manner, the original version of this bill that Mr. Pittenger introduced last year did have filing fees in it. This also would add filing fees, along with a dedicated source of funding from Treasury, from appropriations. I believe in this amendment. I think it makes it stronger, and I believe in the underlying bill. And I can't think of anything more important than the national security and the financial security of our nation. And I believe that this amendment and underlying bill leads us in that right direction for a safer review process of any selling or any interaction with our critical infrastructure, our critical technology, our critical military assets. And I believe this is an important bill. I endorse it. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will support it, and I yield back.
Would you yield to the chairman? I appreciate the gentlelady for yielding. It may not be the spirit of enthusiasm, but in the spirit of compromise and reasonableness, I encourage all members to support the amendment from the gentlelady of New York. I want to thank her for working with the majority side to ensure that there's not an open season on the fees, that there is indeed a ceiling, that there is a reasonable limit. I also note that this was really the original idea of the gentleman from North Carolina, and for lack of a better term, the 1.0 version of the bill. So we are really returning to his vision of this. Again, I think it's in the spirit of compromise. We've reached a good spot on this particular fee provision. I encourage members on both sides of the aisle to support the gentlelady's amendment. I yield back to the gentlelady, and does she yield back her time? Gentlelady yields back her time. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Maloney. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Is there further discussion? For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
I have an amendment on the desk, actually two.
We will pause and allow HEC number 2 to be distributed.
Heck, number 3, I think, sir.
I'm sorry, HEC number 3, apparently.
Thank you.
The clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr. Heck. Page 35, line 18, after paragraph 4, insert the following: to suspend a covered transaction under paragraph.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and here's hoping that spirit of compromise is still beating strongly within your breasts. This amendment allows CFIUS to suspend a transaction and protect the status quo while they're reviewing that transaction. It's in section 16 of the Crapo-Brown substitute, but it's also consistent with the original bill that Mr. Pittenger and I worked on, improved by the subsequent technical feedback. As you know, CFIUS is a voluntary process. Businesses generally choose to go through a CFIUS review and wait until the review is complete before closing a deal, because at the end of that process, they get something. They get safe harbor that CFIUS isn't going to step in at a later time. But there are companies that rush to close a transaction before CFIUS completes its review, or they take other steps to change the facts on the ground before CFIUS completes its review. For example, just 2 months ago.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
The chair is prepared to accept his amendment if the gentleman is prepared to close quickly.
I'm prepared to stop talking altogether, therefore.
Gentleman yields back his time. Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Is there further discussion? For what purposes, gentleman from Washington, press his luck?
My very final amendment, and I promise, sir, is at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Heck, page 29, line 10, strike.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
I'm prepared not to talk at all again, sir, if you're prepared to.
Perhaps the gentleman should proceed with his talk.
Very good, Mr. Chairman. This is my final amendment, and it is simple. It contains the language in Crapo-Brown, the compromise Crapo-Brown bill regarding information sharing with our allies and partners. As I noted earlier, we need to work with our allies to effectively address common threats. I'm pleased to see that Section 503 of this bill does contain language stating that CFIUS should conduct outreach to our allies and partners, but the truth of the matter is that doesn't go far enough. Where's the beef is, I guess, my reaction. The country waiver that would have materially incentivized our allies and partners to set up their own CFIUS-like mechanisms that are compatible with ours is struck out altogether. We are no safer if we block China or Russia from buying a capability in the United States and then they immediately buy it from one of our allies. So I think this also supports the chairman's goal of a more open investment environment. The U.S. government might be more comfortable, for example, selling something to country A if they have assurances it won't be purchased by country B immediately afterwards. I would also note that divergent approaches on new trade issues like cross-border data flows can ultimately turn into a trade barrier for U.S. businesses. So having something to encourage adoption of U.S. standards in the new area of investment security, making sure those reviews stay narrowly focused on national security and aren't used in a protectionist way, that seems to fit very well with the idea of supporting an open investment environment. But putting the country waiver back in would require a fundamental rethinking of this bill, and I won't ask you to do that. But I will ask that we consider just simple information sharing. For example, Australia has its own Foreign Investment Review Board. It's a trusted Five Eyes country and a strong U.S. ally. If we're facing aggressive attempts to steal technology by the same malicious investor, we should be able to share that threat information. My goodness, why wouldn't we want to share that threat information? I can tell you as a member of the Intelligence Committee, I know how important that kind of sharing is and that kind of reciprocity is to supporting our security. I find it inexplicable, frankly, that Section 306, dealing with information sharing, does not include Crapo Brown's common sense language about cooperating with our allies and partners. So this amendment just puts that back in. Frankly, our allies and our friends are looking for us to show leadership, but the current language in the bill doesn't let us offer the kind of substantive cooperation that I think is truly necessary and for not just us to be secure, but for our allies to be secure. This is the way that we are all safer together. I know there are some that would say that they're concerned about the revelation of business information, to which I would only say, my goodness, when you consider the kind of sensitive information that these same members of the IC, these same members of our security community already have, it pales. This would pale in comparison to that. And the reason that we entrust them, these people with the highest classified ratings, whatever we call ourselves when we get access to secrets, the reason we trust them with that is because it keeps us safe. And reinserting this language, as we had in the original bill, would help us to do that as well. And so I'm hoping that this simple amendment could be adopted as well. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose? Gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I want to recognize again the leadership of Mr. Heck on CFIUS modernization and appreciate the spirit in which he is working here today. However, I must oppose this amendment because I believe it is an overreach, and even discussions with the administration, we sense they understand it's an overreach. Under current law, CFIUS confidentiality measures are comprehensive. People often refer to CFIUS as a black box, even within the government, but that's for a reason. When you're dealing with U.S. trade secrets and personal information on U.S. citizens, you need to protect that information. Otherwise, trust in CFIUS will falter. Under earlier proposals, CFIUS would be allowed to divulge any information filed with it to a domestic or foreign government entity. But which entities? Which foreign governments? If we're so concerned about foreign governments' involvement in investment transactions, and that's true not only under FIRRMA but also under current law, then shouldn't we be inherently suspicious of disclosing sensitive information with them? In talks with the administration, our understanding is that this is not what they're seeking to do. Rather, they want to be able to discuss the basic contours of transactions and risks related to certain parties. Fair enough, but if that is the policy goal, then even the language should reflect that. Giving the government a blank check to share this information is simply unwise. And it's not a case where we can even say trust but verify. With CFIUS, there will be no verification that this authority has been used responsibly until it's too late. So while I'm sensitive to the need for CFIUS to have sufficient leeway to discuss risks with foreign countries, we need to be sure that sharing information doesn't itself become a national security risk. That's going to take clear and tailored language to address privacy concerns that every American has a right to care about. Again, I appreciate the work of the amendment sponsor, but must urge my colleagues to vote down this amendment. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. The nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. Is there further discussion? For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
This is Sherman 2. Mr. Chairman, I could speak while they're distributing it. My remarks will be rather short.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Sherman, page 41 after line.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
This is not the most important amendment I will offer, but I think it's a no-brainer. It simply says that if you're a refugee from one of those countries and legally admitted to the United States, this doesn't apply to you. But obviously, we do not want a company based in Iran to acquire U.S. assets. We have sanctions against that, perhaps, but if there was ever going to be a CFIUS prohibition, it would be from a company based in a state sponsor of terrorism. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for
Mr.
5
Chairman, I appreciate this amendment on state sponsors of terrorism. Thanks to the work of Mr. Sherman and others on the committee, the bill we have before us today explicitly restricts investment involving these countries. Yet that is why this amendment shouldn't be adopted. First, a transaction involving control will always be subject to CFIUS review, including from a state sponsor of terrorism. And as we heard from our committee hearings, you're almost certainly not going to get through CFIUS if you're connected with one of these countries. This assumes you're not already sanctioned, which is frequently the case. So what this amendment seems to do is go after third country nationals, for instance, Europeans, who may also live in a country like Iran or Syria. Perhaps they're diplomats, perhaps they're humanitarian workers, perhaps they're academics. This is an odd target to go after, and I believe the approach of Mr. Pittenger's bill is more effective. Under FIRRMA 2018, you can be connected to a state sponsor of terrorism no matter where you are in the world. And if you conduct a transaction, it doesn't even have to be a control transaction. You're covered. You're covered by CFIUS if you would obtain the things we should be worried about most for the reasons of national security. That means U.S. citizens' sensitive personal data and influence over the use and development of critical technologies. So, FIRRMA 2018 is actually stronger than this amendment, and it gets at national security risks in a more effective way. Again, I respect the gentleman for his hard work in shaping the text of this bill, but urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like unanimous consent to withdraw the amendment if it's not going to have the gentleman.
Without objection. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I have two amendments at the desk, Sherman 4 and 5, and would ask unanimous consent to consider them en bloc.
Without objection, we'll pause and allow the new amendment to be distributed. The clerk will report. They just verifies what we said.
Amendments 4 and 5 offered by Mr. Sherman. Amendment 4, page 30, after line 8, insert the following: 2, in paragraph 3, by striking the comma at the end of the...
Without objection, the reading of the amendments are dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized on his amendments.
First, let me take a minute to discuss the amendment I won't be offering, and that is an amendment to allow a look back when a company develops a technology after it is acquired by foreign interests, particularly those in countries of concern. I hope that the chair and others would work with me on this concept, but I won't offer the amendment. Now turning to amendments Sherman 4 and 5, The first of these, and we have worked with the chair to make a slight change in the number 4, says that in looking at a proposed investment, we look at the effect it could have on our workforce and whether it will deprive America of a workforce whose knowledge and skills are critical to our national security. So when we're in a circumstance in which agreeing to a CFIUS transaction will mean that a workforce and its skills that are necessary for our national security, that those jobs will be in another country, and we won't have a workforce that can perform that important work important to our national security, that will be considered, or at least should be considered.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield.
If the gentleman is prepared to rapidly close, the chairman is prepared to accept his amendments.
And also part of this en bloc is Sherman number 5, dealing with companies based in countries of special concerns that do not have market economies. I yield back.
Gentleman yields, well, if you yield to the chairman, just to make it very clear, the
yield to
chair
the
is recommending acceptance of Sherman amendments in bloc. I yield back to the chairman, yield back to the gentleman, gentleman yields back to the chairman. Who else seeks recognition? Is there further debate on the amendment? If not, the question occurs on the amendments offered in bloc by the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendments are adopted. Is there further discussion? There being no further discussion or amendments to for what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Are we at the stage of the process we're back on speaking on the bill as amended, if we're past amendments?
Let me see if the gentleman has already spoken. If not, I'm sure somebody might be able to yield time. Gentleman did not speak during general debate, so gentleman move to strike the last word. Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to vote yes on this bill, and that was not an easy position to get to. In fact, it was exceedingly difficult. Outside of Congressman Barr and Congressman Pittenger, I doubt there's anybody on this committee who's worked longer and harder on this issue. I don't think this bill goes far enough. And I worry that there are gaps here with respect to issues of national security that are important. That said, I want to acknowledge, as I hope I have enough, that the process that has been used in getting us to this point under Mr. Barr's leadership and Ms. Moore's and the subcommittee has been fair and open and honest. In addition, the outstanding concerns that I have been assured by Mr. Barr that he is willing to sit down in good faith and deal with. And that issue principally relates to holes in this legislation as we are now contemplating it for CFIUS review of non-controlling interest in either critical infrastructure or technology. I think at the end of the day, we have the same objective, but we disagree as to whether or not the language as written actually accomplishes that. But again, Congressman Barr has done nothing but deal in good faith thus far, and so we're going to give it another try on this particular point. So I'm voting yes to move the bill along with a very strong reservation in this area, but with a lot of hope that the process can yield an even improved product over that which we're contemplating now. I do want to make clear, however, that I am reserving the right to enthusiastically oppose this bill if we cannot get to yes. I just am choosing for the time being, based on all the hard work to date, to throw myself in with hope and a commitment to engage in, on my side, with my concerns in every bit as much good faith as I acknowledge that Congressman Barr has evidenced over the last many, many months. I want to thank the ranking member and the chair and the subcommittee chair and ranking member, as well as my colleague from North Carolina for all of their work to date. Our journey's not done. We should be very mindful of the fact that what we're dealing with here, as I acknowledged earlier on one of my amendments, my first comprehensive amendments, is arguably the most important bill that we've dealt with in this session of the Congress before this committee. We should be reminded that what we're dealing with here are matters of sensitive and important national security, and it warrants us giving it the effort that implies. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yield.
Yes.
Just very briefly, I want to thank the gentleman for working in good faith with us, and I once again applaud his leadership on this issue, and he has contributed mightily to this, and in my judgment, improving the legislation, and we'll continue to work with him to improve the legislation. And I thank you, and yield back to the gentleman.
Well, gentleman, yield.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Heck. You've been a great partner in this process. I really respect the work that you've done. I think what you have brought to this table today is particularly important. And you've just been a good ally for the objectives that we all seek to secure this country. I thank Mr. Barr, I thank Mr. Henseling, thank Ms. Waters, and all who've been involved.
Thank you both very much for your kind remarks. Now, Mr. Pittenger, you need to work the gentleman from Kentucky over a little bit before we actually sit down. Make sure you get him in the right frame of mind.
Bourbon.
Finally, I am finally yielding back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there further discussion? If not, there being no further amendments, record votes on the pending amendments have been postponed. Once those votes are taken, the committee will immediately consider the motions to adopt the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended, if amended, and to report the measure. I now call up H.R. 4735. The clerk will report, 5735. The clerk will report the bill which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 5735, to amend the United States Housing Act of 1937.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, the sponsor of the legislation, for 5 minutes, if he's paying attention. Mr. Barr, your bill is up, just in case you didn't have enough work to do.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. We all know that the opioid epidemic is a major health crisis that has impacted every community and every congressional district. 115 Americans die every day from opioid overdoses. My home state of Kentucky has the third highest overdose mortality rate in the country. The Centers for Disease Control estimates that the total economic burden of prescription opioid misuse alone in the United States is $78.5 billion per year, and workforce participation is estimated to have fallen accordingly. Congress has worked in recent years to allocate more federal resources to fighting the opioid epidemic through the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act, the 21st Century Cures Act, and the recent government funding bill. But more work remains. Current federal programs focus on treatment and prevention, but do not address the needs of individuals who complete intensive treatment but require continued support. In light of the national public health emergency announced by President Trump last fall, there is a pressing need for additional transitional housing for opioid recovery, a proven evidence-based approach that has helped thousands of Americans maintain sobriety after completing rehab, gain valuable skills and job training, obtain employment, and eventually transition back into society to lead independent lives. Too many individuals find themselves with limited housing choices after completing inpatient rehabilitation and are forced into housing situations where they are surrounded by the very people using the very same illegal substances that they went to rehab to stop using. This perpetuates the cycle of addiction and prevents individuals from rising above substance abuse. A recent report by the Urban Institute found that shelter-based opioid therapy can improve both individual and public health outcomes. And HUD Secretary Ben Carson visited several transitional housing nonprofits in my district in Kentucky earlier this year, including the Hope Center and St. James Place, and he witnessed firsthand the success of these evidence-based models of recovery. My legislation, H.R. 5735, the Transitional Housing for Recovery and Viable Environments Act, or the THRIVE Act, would make transitional housing more accessible to those most in need by allocating a limited number of Section 8 housing choice vouchers to nonprofits that provide housing, job training, and continued support for individuals who are transitioning out of rehab and back into the workforce. Rather than requiring vouchers to go through public housing authorities, this demonstration would give vouchers directly to housing nonprofits that meet evidence-based metrics of success on a competitive basis. And these are nonprofits with experience in housing. Some of them have dealt directly with public housing authorities. The vouchers would also be distributed with a focus on regions of the country with the highest rates of opioid-related deaths. The THRIVE Act would only allocate either $10,000 or 0.5% of total housing choice vouchers, whichever is less, to people who are literally dying each and every day of opioid addiction. And the demonstration would be limited to 5 years. There is more we need to do to help individuals suffering from the opioid epidemic, but the THRIVE Act is an important start. Based on feedback we've received from various stakeholders, nonprofits that treat other substance abuse disorders, such as alcoholism and crack cocaine addiction, we have amended the legislation, and also from feedback from our friends on the other side of the aisle, we've amended this legislation to make sure that all substance abuse disorders such as those are eligible for this demonstration. Our federal housing programs are an underutilized resource in fighting the opioid epidemic. As other committees in Congress continue to work towards a large legislative package of opioid bills, I urge my colleagues on the Financial Services Committee to consider how we can do our part to fight this national public health crisis. The THRIVE Act would save American lives, as well as taxpayer funds in the long run by helping more individuals rise above addiction and poverty. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair wishes to alert all members that there is currently a vote pending on the floor, a series of 4 votes. The next bill, I believe, probably is broadly supported on both sides of the aisle, so perhaps the chairman will issue his hope and wish we can get through this in the next roughly 10 minutes. For what purpose does the ranking member seek?
I move to strike the last
Gentlelady's recognized for what I hope will prove to be less than 5 minutes.
This bill would set aside 10,000 vouchers within the Section 8 program for persons with substance use disorders. We have an epidemic of substance abuse in this country, and I and Democrats have advocated for many proposals to address these issues. However, this bill would rob Peter to pay Paul by telling millions of people who have been waiting and waiting for a housing voucher that they have to wait a little bit longer because Congress refuses to increase the number of Section 8 vouchers. Instead, Republicans want to let some people cut in front of families with young children, elderly and disabled households, and other people in need who in many cases have been waiting years for a voucher. Once again, Republicans are attempting to help some people by taking assistance away from others because they refuse to advocate for increased funding necessary to address the problem. This bill would also impose up to a 2-year time limit on these individuals with substance abuse use disorders, which is problematic as many individuals need long-term or permanent supportive housing to successfully recover. Further, there are serious concerns with the administration of this program, as it would essentially take vouchers away from public housing agencies and give them to nonprofits that may not have any experience. Mr. Chairman and members, let me tell you, aside from what I have just identified as what is wrong with this bill, you know what's happening in public housing. We put people out with substance abuse problems. We're kicking people out of public housing, and now you tell me you want to take vouchers away from families and give them to others with substance abuse problems. Look, I really recognize your compassion for wanting to do something with the opioid population. This is not the way to do it. Let's not rob Peter to pay Paul. And again, we are kicking people out of public housing with substance abuse problems. We don't have any special anything for them. And to tell you the truth, I want to do everything that we can to help with the opioid problem, but I'm still working on the crack problem in many communities. And I want to tell you, if I came in here with a bill talking about putting crack users ahead of families, you would think I was crazy. So no, I will not support this bill. I don't think it is constructed in a way that is the best way to help with the opioid abuse. I would want us to expand the number of vouchers so that we could take care of people. It's just going to cost money to do so. So please don't, rob Peter to pay Paul, or favor, one sector of our society over the other. Let's do the right thing, and let's go get the money and the resources to help all of the people who need it. Thank you.
Gentlelady yield back. The chair wishes to apprise members there's approximately 11 minutes left on the vote. I understand more speakers wish to speak on this bill. So I believe we will probably go to one, maybe two more speakers and recess. Again, I'm led to believe that the bill from the gentleman from Wisconsin has broad bipartisan support, which means votes on all pending matters might occur roughly 6:30 to 6:45, depending on how quickly floor debate goes. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose? Gentlelady from Utah seek recognition.
Last word.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to commend Mr. Barr for tackling this important topic of transitional housing to support individuals trying to break the cycle of addiction. We're all too painfully aware of the opioid epidemic that has swept the country. Usage of opioids trap people in a downward spiral, and this is personal because I'm devastated to say that my home state of Utah has the 7th highest per capita drug overuse rate in the nation now. Helping people out of this downward spiral requires many different touch points, including rehabilitation, jobs and life skills training, and for some people, temporary transitional housing is one of those needed services. Here in Congress, we've also been working actively to provide a variety of needed supports, funding for substance abuse prevention and treatment programs, investigating pill dumping and patient brokering, and supporting education for healthcare professionals. This bill directly directs us towards another underutilized resource to help overcome the opioid crisis, housing. The Thrive Act helps provide transitional housing to a limited number of people by targeting resources only to those who are participating in programs that provide evidence-based treatments and job skills training according to the standards established by HUD. I, again, want to commend Mr. Barr for his efforts. I thank the chairman for moving this bill forward, and I yield back.
Would the gentlelady yield? Right over here. Sean.
The gentleman from Wisconsin is seeking.
Yes, I yield.
I want to commend Mr. Barr as well. I think this is an innovative and creative approach that he's trying to address a real problem that so many of our communities face. And what we see with opioids, it's not like alcoholism. It's not like other drugs. It takes a long time to get people on the path to recovery, and making sure they have sufficient housing with the right kind of treatment is imperative if we're going to, again, move people away from addiction. And cutting out the PHAs and providing the resources to the housing provider, so we can not throw people right back into the same environment that led them down the path of addiction, but put them in a healthier environment, keep them clean with positive influences in their lives, give them job training so they can live a fulfilled and drug-free life. I think this is a great approach, and I just think it's important that we're not talking about changing the whole program. It's what, 0.5%, Mr. Barr, or 10,000 vouchers, whichever is less. So we're talking about a small sliver here. If this works, this could be a model on how we move forward. It's a demonstration project that I think is the right focused approach. It's limited. Let's see if it works. But we have problems across America with opioids, and we don't know how to handle it. We don't know how to deal with this addiction. And I know that Mr. Barr has problems in his community. I have them in mine. We all do. So let's think outside the box, how to help folks. And again, we're not taking vouchers away from people. We're helping folks who would get vouchers anyway, but give them a little longer landing pad with, again, a treatment program that will bring them to a place of recovery. If I could, Well, I know we've had a debate going back and forth on how this bill could be modified, and I think my friends across the aisle have made some pretty good points. We've tried to tweak and modify this bill to get bipartisan buy-in. Hopefully, if there's ways we could continue to work together, I think that would be beneficial. But again, this is a crisis that's affecting our country that we haven't figured out how to wrap our hands around, and I think this is a good first approach by Mr. Barr. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Budd.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So I want to thank my friend Mr. Barr of Kentucky for his leadership on this Thrive Act. This is an important piece of legislation. I'm proud to call myself a co-sponsor. The National Institute of Drug Abuse found that we lose 115 Americans every single day. I think that's actually a low number, but it's an unfortunate number. And this is a national crisis, and inaction will not change a single thing. When I hear people tell me this, it reminds me of a conversation I had recently with David Kessler, who lives in my district and started an organization called Grip It. It has group classes, one-on-one coaching, assistance, detox programs. There's just a few of the things that they offer. He found evidence of a cultural method that works, and it shows us there are so many different things that we could be trying. This takes me to the bill that we're marking up and we're voting on today. And Mr. Chairman, as I run out of time, I've moved to strike the last words if there is another moment or so.
There is presently time of the gentlelady has expired, and there are 5 minutes remaining on the vote on the floor, so the committee stands in recess. Will come to order. Who seeks recognition? For what? We are on general debate on 5735. Okay. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
We'll pause briefly and allow the amendment to be distributed. Is the gentleman sure he has an amendment at the desk?
I'm sorry.
The gentleman now has an amendment at the desk, and the amendment will be distributed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Barr on page 3, strike line 13 and 14, and
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I offer a manager's amendment to my bill, H.R. 5735, the Thrive Act, to improve accountability in this demonstration program and further ensure that organizations that participate are well-equipped to assist individuals recovering from substance abuse. As a condition for eligibility in this demonstration program, this amendment requires nonprofits to demonstrate prior experience administering rental assistance vouchers, transitional housing programs under the McKinney-Vento Act, or partnerships with state, local, or tribal government housing programs. I'd like to thank Congresswoman Sinema for suggesting several of the improvements to the bill that are included in this amendment and responding to some of the feedback that we received from Ranking Member Cleaver and others regarding this issue. I'm hopeful that we can work together in a bipartisan manner to improve housing options for individuals recovering from opioid addiction and other substance abuse disorders. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? Was there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. Is there further discussion? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill as amended, reported to the House with a favorable recommendation.
It's got amendments to the bill.
I have an amendment, Mr. Chairman.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
It's this one. Yeah, no amendment on the second one.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Cleaver, strike all after the enacting clause and insert.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with, and the gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all thank the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, for the flexibility in making sure that we went beyond just opioids in terms of the people who could benefit if this legislation is in fact approved. Substance abuse goes and it takes in a variety of very dangerous drugs, and I appreciate that movement. The amendment I have addresses the other concern that was expressed earlier by the ranking member, and this amendment would require 10,000 vouchers under the Housing Choice Voucher Program, and this would make sure that even though we are going to use this program to help some very needy people who are in one of the biggest crises that we've had in terms of drug abuse, like crack and heroin devastated the urban core. But the problem that has not been addressed is the fact that we would address one problem and then create another. So it would be my hope that this resolution could clear that problem up, or if there is another means by which we can make sure that we don't do anything to damage the housing voucher program, then this would be unnecessary. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose? Gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, I certainly appreciate the ranking member of the Housing Subcommittee's thoughtfulness and appreciate his willingness to work with us in supporting the general concept. I'm concerned about the amendment in a couple of respects. First of all, with respect to the ranking member of the full committee's concern and others perhaps concerned about the number of vouchers or the idea that it might take away from current recipients. Remember, this is a demonstration program only, and it would only allocate either 10,000 vouchers or literally 0.05% of the total vouchers. So we're not talking about taking away from people. More efficiency in the Section 8 housing would make up for this. We're talking about 0.5% of all allocations. And by the way, you're not taking away vouchers. You're having a demonstration project on allocation or 10,000 vouchers. And these are people who are literally dying every day of opioid addiction and need supportive housing to help them transition back into the workforce and maintain sobriety. A very small number of vouchers to address a national public health crisis would seem to be justified, and this demonstration is limited to 5 years to see if it works. And the goal of this demonstration is not to take away vouchers from those who need them, but rather to open up other housing options to people coming out of rehab who, frankly, would otherwise be forced to use Section 8 vouchers to live in a housing situation where they would be surrounded by individuals who are using opioids or other substances. So if our goal is to help people coming out of rehab and stay off of opioids, gain job skills, find employment, our government program should give people the option to live in transitional housing with Section 8 vouchers. The other problem that I would have with the amendment, as I see it, is it does circumvent one of the core purposes of the bill by requiring, as I read it, correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Cleaver, but it does look like it requires a joint submission by the partnering nonprofit and a public housing authority. Am I reading that correctly? And I'll yield.
Yes, sir.
And here's, and I'll reclaim my time. Here's the problem with that. What we're trying to do is innovate. We're trying to do something different. We're trying to think out of the box. The purpose of the amendment in the nature of the substitute, or the manager's amendment that I offered in conjunction with Ms. Sinema, was to make sure that the nonprofits do have housing experience, that they, and hopefully that improved the bill in your eyes, that these are not just nonprofits with no housing experience. They have worked with HUD in the past. They're proven HUD contractors. They've worked under the McKinney-Vento Act or other partnerships with government housing programs, so they're not novices. And that would be a criteria for eligibility. What we don't want, though, and what we think would diminish the demonstration would be a micromanaging by a public housing authority, requiring them to partner hand in hand. What we want is to liberate these not-for-profits that have housing experience, that have worked with PHAs in the past, to use Section 8 vouchers with their experience, couple it with the job training, the financial literacy that they provide, the 12-step programs, the accountability in a sober living environment, and then look at it. And we're talking about a very small number of vouchers. Look at it after 5 years and see what the outcomes are. Have we moved these people to permanent, non-subsidized housing and sustained recovery, or are we not getting better results? And that's what we want to look at, and I'll yield to the gentleman if he has any feedback on that.
Yeah, thank you. The gentleman from Kentucky has been very helpful. I'm not sure that I completely understand. Let me make an example. Let me do a for instance. If you have 10,000 people on the waiting list for vouchers in New York City, are you saying that the voucher program it would not be impacted even though we are going to have a certain number of individuals who are involved with opioids and other drugs moving in to units. And so you're saying there's not going to be a reduction?
Well, reclaiming my time, there obviously are waiting lists everywhere in the country, and we got to deal with those waiting lists. I will work with you on those waiting lists, but what this is taking 0.5% across the whole system out of 2.2 million people and saying, look, there's already people on waiting lists. That's a separate problem. I want to work with you on that separate problem. But what we want to do with the existing allocation is we want to test whether or not using 0.05% of these, or 10,000, but no greater, are we getting better results by helping not-for-profits that have experience getting people into long-term sustained recovery. That's the idea, and so we don't think we have any measurable impact in terms of the existing population. And furthermore, if you think about it, most of the people who are coming out of rehab, they're penniless. They would be eligible for Section 8 vouchers anyway because they've exhausted all of their personal resources. So it's not like we're taking away from anyone who otherwise would be. These are people who are totally desperate because they've exhausted all of their personal resources. They would be eligible for Section 8 vouchers anyway. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the ranking member seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment would replace the text of this bill with language that would appropriate funding for 10,000 vouchers dedicated to persons with substance use disorders. Under this amendment, there would be no arbitrary time limits to ensure that individuals can make a full and healthy recovery without threat of eviction. This amendment would also ensure that PHAs would continue to administer these vouchers, but would do so in partnership with nonprofits that provide supportive services. In short, if we're serious about helping people with substance use disorders, we need to get serious about providing the funding necessary to do so. Mr. Chairman and members, I understand what is being attempted here, but I also understand the many calls, the many pleas that I get from mothers, mainly with children, about Section 8 vouchers. If you're saying somehow that this disaster that we're facing, basically with opioids, that's really what you're dealing with, is of such a nature that they deserve to have better treatment than those who have even addictions that were different. Addictions because of heroin, and many of the opioid addictions have turned into heroin addictions, by the way. Then I question that. We need more vouchers. We need more resources. If you're going to take away 10,000, put 10,000 back in. I mean, you know, we just don't have enough with people waiting and standing in line for years. And I'm talking about mothers with children and families who are desperate, homeless on the street. And I don't know why, you know, those who are addicted, that we are very concerned about, and we would like to be in the position to do real rehabilitation. I don't know why they would come ahead of these women and children. And so I don't support this. I support, however, putting more money in the system, expanding the number of vouchers. At least if you're going to take 10,000 out, put 10,000 in. Otherwise, it's not fair. It's not right. And we have people long before the opioid addiction came along. Many of them are still on the street, suffering. And I want to tell you, on public housing, those who are guilty of drug abuse, who are addicted, they get put out of public housing. So we're putting out some because I guess they're less important than some others. This does not make good sense. And so I'm opposed to the bill and this amendment. And I would ask, I support the amendment, And I would ask support for this amendment because I think that it would make things a lot fairer.
Gentlelady yield back. Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks? Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying no. No, in the opinion of the chair, the noes appear to have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not adopted. Is there further discussion? For what purpose, the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Chris on page
Without
5.
objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. The gentleman is recognized on his amendment.
I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be considered read.
Thank
you.
Recognized on his amendment.
The bill before us seeks to address the crushing reality of homelessness within the opioid crisis, a very worthy and frankly overdue goal. And for his attention to this issue, I thank the author. While I appreciate his creativity moving housing vouchers from housing authorities and HUD to nonprofits, I remain concerned about the very real possibility for discrimination. My district in Pinellas County, Florida, boasts one of the largest, most vibrant LGBT communities in the country. We support and celebrate this because our LGBT neighbors make our community stronger. However, even in 2018, members of that community are more likely to suffer from homelessness, addiction, and the denial of treatment and care. If the underlying bill truly seeks to tackle homelessness and addiction, and I believe it does, it would be negligent oversight to leave the LGBT community behind. My amendment would very simply require treatment providers to certify that they are not in the business of discrimination. This isn't a hypothetical issue. It isn't a feel-good issue. It's happening today, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose, gentleman from Kentucky, seek recognition?
I seek, move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I respect the gentleman's idea, but my understanding is that this committee does not have jurisdiction over the Civil Rights Act, that's a Judiciary Committee jurisdictional issue, and therefore we would not have jurisdiction to amend the legislation because of that. And, you know, the other point is some of these nonprofits are faith-based organizations, but I know of none of the ones certainly in my district that I know, the groups that I'm familiar with, they're not in the business of discrimination. They're in the business of loving people. They're in the business of taking everyone in who is suffering from addiction and getting them to recovery. The idea that these groups are not would be in the business of discrimination just is inconsistent with the reality and the experience that we've seen. These are some of the most compassionate people who want to help. They come to them broken. These people come to these situations from jail. They come to these situations addicted, relapsed, many overdoses. They come in all shapes and sizes, and they take everybody they can. The issue is not turning people away. The issue is they don't have the resources to take people in. So the point of the bill is not exclusionary. The point of the bill is inclusive. It's trying to help provide more resources to these organizations. So it's an unnecessary bill from that it's an unnecessary amendment from that standpoint, but it's also apparently outside of the jurisdiction of this committee, and that's why I in good faith, oppose the gentleman's suggestion, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose? Ranking member seek recognition.
I move to strike the last one.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and members, under the Trump administration, the future of fair housing is under threat. Secretary Carson has taken several steps to undermine fair housing, including the removal of several online resources that were intended to help housing providers ensure compliance with HUD. Non-discrimination rules that protect LGBTQ people, according to one survey, LGBTQ youth are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than their peers, and yet Secretary Carson would rather ignore LGBTQ people and ignore discrimination that they face in accessing housing. Unfortunately, even with the positive change that this amendment makes to the bill, it does not fully address my concerns with the underlying bill. For these reasons, I support this amendment, and I continue to oppose the underlying bill.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question now occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Christ. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. Nay, in the opinion of the chair, the nays appear to have it. The nays have it.
Okay.
The amendment is not adopted. Is there further discussion?
Can we get a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman?
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Seek a recorded vote.
Recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted.
Where's the talking point?
Sufficient number having raised their hands. A recorded vote is so ordered pursuant to subsection C5, Rule 3 of the committee rules. Further proceedings on the amendment are postponed. Is there further amendment
I have
or
an amendment.
discussion? We'll pause and allow the amendment to be distributed.
I have an amendment at the desk. Almost at the desk. It's almost at the desk.
For what purpose, gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Is there a Waters amendment at the desk? It's coming to the desk.
This is it. This is the last amendment, right? This is the last one.
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Ms. Water. At the end of the bill, add the following new section, Section 5.
Without objection, the reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Gentlelady is recognized on her amendment.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, this bill seeks to provide housing assistance for people with substance use disorders, but fails to address overly harsh eviction policies governing our federal housing programs that act as a barrier for people with substance use disorders. That is why I introduced the Fair Chance at Housing Act, which would, among other things, reform the eviction policies for federal housing assistance to assure that people with substance use disorders have a fair chance to rebuild their lives. My amendment would add a modified portion of my Fair Chance at Housing Act, H.R. 5735, which would ensure fair eviction procedures when the cause of the eviction proceeding is illicit drug use. In particular, it would ban one-strike policies which tenants can be evicted for a single instance of illicit drug use. If the gentleman from Kentucky is serious about helping people with substance use disorders access housing, he will accept this amendment. So I would urge my colleagues to support this amendment. We cannot deal with substance abuse in supportive ways for some, ignore others, or just discount others who have been suffering under some of the policies that we have. This is a fair chance for us to take a look at what we've been doing to some of the least of these in public housing and not attempt to ignore them and try to provide assistance for others. For some reason, one believes that they're better and they deserve more. So I would ask for an aye vote on my amendment.
Gentlelady yield back.
I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Does the gentleman from Kentucky withdraw his?
Withdraw my point of order.
Gentleman withdraws his point of order. The chair recognizes himself to say that the ranking member brings up some interesting issues that probably are deserving of study, should be reviewed in a hearing, but I'm looking at an amendment that I think is quite literally hot off the press since it has a 6:08 date stamp of approximately 13 minutes ago. So this committee has not had any time whatsoever to review this. I'll be happy again. I think the ranking member brings up some interesting issues that are deserving of review, but they are not deserving of an aye vote on the fly. I would urge rejection of the ranking member's amendment based on nothing else but process alone, and I yield back the balance of my time. Who seeks recognition? Is there any further debate on the amendment? If not, the question occurs now on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say nay. Nay. In the opinion, the nays have it. The amendment is not adopted. Is there further discussion? There being no further amendments, record votes on the pending amendments have been postponed. Once those votes are taken, the committee will immediately consider the motion to report the measure. Now pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 5793. The clerk will report the bill, which was distributed in advance.
H.R. 5793.
Without objection, the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Duffy, the sponsor of the legislation, for what he hopes will be less than 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate you bringing this bill up for a markup. I want to also thank Mr. Cleaver for his work and insight on this legislation. A bill giving families that rely on the federal government for their housing needs the ability to pick themselves up so they can find a better job, live in a safer environment, and provide for their children. 5793 would authorize the HUD Secretary to carry out a housing choice voucher demonstration program that is designed to help those receiving housing vouchers to move to lower poverty, more opportunity areas. Currently, the HCV program works with local PHAs to provide housing to our nation's neediest. 75% of recipients are extremely low income, living at or below 30% of the area median income, and there are about 2,200 PHAs that administer 2.2 million vouchers across the nation. Typically, you'll have one PHA in the center of a city with more PHAs serving the surrounding suburbs and towns, creating complexity and inefficiency. In some cases, those PHAs are fighting to keep as many vouchers and government resources as possible to themselves when they're in the same general region. Instead of cooperating, the PHAs have put up barriers that prevent moving from one jurisdiction of a PHA to that of another because they would lose the voucher. It's a perverse incentive when a PHA fights to keep a voucher as opposed to helping individuals move to higher opportunity areas. So this bill would reduce the barriers put up by competing PHAs that prevent families from moving to better their lives. It would allow HUD to implement a plan to regionalize the various PHAs in one area to allow for portability and movement to higher opportunity areas. We know that low-income children whose families move from poor neighborhoods to lower poverty areas have higher earnings as adults. We will increase the chances for them to achieve academic success, reduce intergenerational poverty, and help them live their American dream. I think we can do more to help our poverty-stricken, and this is just one step that'll give people
Thank the gentleman for his work as one of our leaders to reduce poverty in this committee. I want to thank the gentleman from Missouri yet again, for working on a bipartisan basis with the gentleman from Wisconsin. And you're right, it is common sense if we are trying to help people move from lives of poverty to lives of hope and independence. We ought to be able to facilitate moves to where there are greater opportunities, greater economic opportunities. And again, I support the bipartisan work of both gentlemen. I yield back to the gentleman from Wisconsin, who I assume yields back to the chair, who seeks recognition. For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
We'll strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It would be far, far less than 5 minutes because I think that the gentleman from Wisconsin has already made it clear that this would be something of great significance. I was mayor during from 1994 to 1998 period when HUD had developed an experimental program, and mayors all over the country became involved in this program and supporting it. It was called Move the Opportunity, and there was a lottery, and the winners would have an opportunity to get a housing voucher and move. The losers, there were losers who didn't get the opportunity to move, but they measured the families who were the lottery winners and who moved out of PHAs that were in horrible neighborhoods and moved into neighborhoods that are, quote, better, unquote. And the differences were dramatic. And so I think this program would do something very, very similar and hopefully lay the groundwork for something that would be massive. So I'd like to thank the gentleman from Wisconsin for his work. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Who seeks recognition? Is there further amendment or discussion? For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I ask unanimous consent to vacate my request for a recorded vote to the end that the amendment stand disposed of by the earlier voice vote thereon. I'm referring to Heck Amendment number 2, Mr. Chairman, in light of the agreement reached earlier.
Without objection. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose, gentleman from Arkansas, seek recognition?
Right, the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I want to add my thanks to Mr. Cleaver and Mr. Duffy for this excellent piece of flexibility. When I talk to constituents, this is one of the top issues that comes up in the public housing arena is how can we have flexibility in the Section 8 program? And I think this bill takes a small but great common sense step towards that purpose. It also makes me think back to the 1980s when I was on the Housing Reform Commission in Dallas, Texas, back in the mid-1980s. There were 31 public housing authorities in Dallas, Texas. And this is a prime example of a major metro area where this would benefit so many citizens to move around yet preserve their vouchers. So I congratulate Mr. Cleaver and Mr. Duffy, and I'd like to yield some time to Mrs. Love.
Thank you. I also just wanted to briefly add my support and my enthusiasm for H.R. 5791, which is authored by Chairman Duffy and Subcommittee Chairman Cleaver. This is the best part of the work that we do, and we're able to come together and do something to help people, and I can't tell you how proud I am to support this. For over 6 years, the state of Utah has convened in intergenerational poverty commissions that gather data on how to best help families experiencing the cycle of intergenerational poverty break that cycle. Although the commission doesn't specifically focus on housing, it's implicit in the environment plays a large role in opportunities that are available for families to achieve upward mobility for children and to realize their potential. In fact, the studies from other parts of the country have shown that housing mobility, allowing families to move from lower poverty areas and significantly improve the opportunities for their families and their children. And as a mother with 3 children, any opportunity that I have to provide a better environment and hope for my children and children across America is going to be absolutely personal. So I have to say that I am incredibly proud of the work that's been done here, and I yield back the remainder of my time to Mr. Hill.
I thank the gentleman. Yield back to the chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion or amendment? There being no further discussion or amendments to the bill, the question now occurs on ordering the bill reported favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the
Yes,
chair,
for recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
a recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered and pursuant to subsection C5, Rule 3 of the committee rules. The vote on this question is postponed. We will now recess for 5 minutes, at which time we will reconvene and begin our recorded votes. The committee stands in recess.
Could we get 10 minutes? Please, 10 minutes.
Because the ranking member has been so persuasive, as always, the committee will declare a 10-minute recess. The committee stands in recess. Will come to order. Members are asked to please take their seats. I now call up H.R. 5841. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 5841, to modernize and strengthen the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to more effectively guard against the risk of the national security of the United States posed by certain types of foreign investment and for other purposes.
Question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry? No. Mr. McHenry, no. Mr. King? No. Mr. King, no. Mr. Royce? Mr. Royce, no. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas, no. Mr. Pierce? Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey, no. Mr. Lugemeyer? Mr. Lugemeyer, no. Mr. Huizenga? Mr. Huizenga, no. Mr. Duffy? Mr. Duffy, no. Mr. Stivers? Mr. Holcren? Mr. Holcren, no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Pittenger? Mr. Pittenger, no. Mrs. Wagner? Mrs. Wagner, no. Mr. Barr? Mr. Barr, no. Mr. Rothfuss? Mr. Rothfuss, no. Mr. Messer? Mr. Messer, no. Mr. Tipton? Mr. Tipton, no. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams, no. Mr. Poliquin? Mr. Poliquin, no. Mrs. Love? Mrs. Love, no. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, no. Mr. Emmer? Mr. Emmer, no. Mr. Zeldin? Mr. Zeldin, no. Mr. Trott? Mr. Trott, no. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Loudermilk, no. Mr. Mooney? Mr. Mooney, no. Mr. MacArthur? Mr. MacArthur, no. Mr. Davidson? Mr. Davidson, no. Mr. Budd? Mr. Budd, no. Mr. Kustoff? Mr. Kustoff, no. Ms. Tenney? Ms. Tenney, no. Mr. Hollingsworth? Mr. Hollingsworth, no. Ms. Waters? Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney? Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Velasquez? Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman? Mr. Meeks? Mr. Capuano? Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott? Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green? Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver? Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore? Mr. Ellison? Mr. Perlmutter? Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes? Mr. Himes, pass. Mr. Foster? Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee? Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney? Ms. Sinema? Ms. Sinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty? Mr. Heck? Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas? Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer? Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez? Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Chris? Mr. Chris, aye. Mr. Kewen? Mr. Chairman?
No.
Chairman, no.
Is there any member who has not voted? Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Meeks? Mr. Meeks?
Is there any other member who has not voted? Gentleman from Connecticut.
Mr. Himes, aye.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Sherman? Mr. Sherman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 20 and the nays are 32.
The amendment is not agreed to. The question now occurs on adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger. All those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it, and the amendment is adopted. The question now occurs on reporting the bill favorably to the House as amended. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Ask for the ayes and nays.
Recorded vote. Either gentleman
Recorded
from
vote.
North Carolina. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry? Aye. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King? Aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce? Aye. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas? Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce? Mr. Posey? Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lugemeyer? Mr. Lugemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga? Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy? Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers? Mr. Holcren? Mr. Holcren, aye. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger? Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner? Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr? Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss? Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer? Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton? Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams? Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin? Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love? Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill? Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer? Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin? Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there a member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 53 and the nays are 0.
A majority having voted in favor of the bill as amended, the bill as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes. Members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 5735. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 5735 to amend the United States Housing Act of 1937 to establish a demonstration program to set aside Section 8 housing vouchers for supportive and transitional housing for individuals recovering from opioid use disorders and other substance use disorders and for other purposes.
Question now occurs on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida on which a recorded vote was ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Mr. McHenry, no. Mr. King. Mr. King, no. Mr. Royce. Mr. Royce, no. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, no. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, no. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, no. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, no. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, no. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Holgren. Mr. Holgren, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, no. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, no. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, no. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, no. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, no. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, no. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, no. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, no. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, no. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, no. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, no. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, no. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, no. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, no. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, no. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, no. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff, no. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, no. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, no. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Mr. Ellison.
Gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Chris. Mr. Chris, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Chairman.
No. Is there many?
Chairman, no.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 21 and the nays are 32.
The amendment then is not agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill favorably to the House. Those in favor shall signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed shall signify by saying nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes appear to have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition? Gentleman from Kentucky, going once, twice. A recorded vote has been requested. All those in favor of a recorded vote shall raise their hand and be counted. A sufficient number having raised their hands, a recorded vote is so ordered. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Aye. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Aye. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Aye. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Posey. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy.
Aye.
Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Hulkren. Mr. Hulkren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Custuff. Mr. Custuff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, no. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, no. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, no. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, no. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, no. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, no. Ms. Moore. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, no. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, no. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, no. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, no. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Delaney. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Cinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, no. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, no. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Chris. Mr. Chris, no. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 34 and the nays are 19.
A majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes. Members have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. I now call up H.R. 5793. The clerk will designate the bill by title.
H.R. 5793 to authorize the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development to carry out a housing choice voucher mobility demonstration to encourage families receiving such voucher assistance to move to low poverty areas and expand access to opportunity areas.
Question now is on reporting the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. McHenry. Aye. Mr. McHenry, aye. Mr. King. Aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Royce. Aye. Mr. Royce, aye. Mr. Lucas. Mr. Lucas, aye. Mr. Pierce. Mr. Posey. Aye. Mr. Posey, aye. Mr. Lukemeyer. Aye. Mr. Lukemeyer, aye. Mr. Huizenga. Mr. Huizenga, aye. Mr. Duffy. Mr. Duffy, aye. Mr. Stivers. Mr. Hulkren. Mr. Hulkren, aye. Mr. Ross. Mr. Ross, aye. Mr. Pittenger. Mr. Pittenger, aye. Mrs. Wagner. Mrs. Wagner, aye. Mr. Barr. Mr. Barr, aye. Mr. Rothfuss. Mr. Rothfuss, aye. Mr. Messer. Mr. Messer, aye. Mr. Tipton. Mr. Tipton, aye. Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams, aye. Mr. Poliquin. Mr. Poliquin, aye. Mrs. Love. Mrs. Love, aye. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, aye. Mr. Emmer. Mr. Emmer, aye. Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Zeldin, aye. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott, aye. Mr. Loudermilk. Mr. Loudermilk, aye. Mr. Mooney. Mr. Mooney, aye. Mr. MacArthur. Mr. MacArthur, aye. Mr. Davidson. Mr. Davidson, aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Custuff. Mr. Custuff, aye. Ms. Tenney. Ms. Tenney, aye. Mr. Hollingsworth. Mr. Hollingsworth, aye. Ms. Waters. Ms. Waters, aye. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney, aye. Ms. Velasquez. Ms. Velasquez, aye. Mr. Sherman. Mr. Sherman, aye. Mr. Meeks. Mr. Meeks, aye. Mr. Capuano. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay, aye. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Green. Mr. Green, aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver, aye. Ms. Moore. Mr. Ellison. Mr. Ellison, aye. Mr. Perlmutter. Mr. Perlmutter, aye. Mr. Himes. Mr. Himes, aye. Mr. Foster. Mr. Foster, aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Delaney. Ms. Cinema. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mrs. Beatty. Mr. Heck. Mr. Heck, aye. Mr. Vargas. Mr. Vargas, aye. Mr. Gottheimer. Mr. Gottheimer, aye. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, aye. Mr. Christ. Mr. Christ, aye. Mr. Kewen. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Chairman, aye.
Is there any member who has not voted? Is there any member who wishes to change his or her vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, the ayes are 54 and the nays are 0.
A majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered As members exit, please exit quietly. A majority having voted in favor of the bill is ordered favorably reported to the House. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Staff are authorized to make technical or conforming changes, and members will have 2 days to file views on the reported measure. There being no further business pending, the committee stands adjourned.